and begin our discussion, everybody. There is so much to talk about and not a lot of time. Yes, I will. I think it's working now. So let me just get right down to business. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Charles Lister. Charles will be leading the discussion. He's a senior fellow at MEI and director of the Countering Terrorism and Extremism program. His work focuses primarily on the conflict in Syria. And as Ed put it so eloquently tonight, he is a hero to so many in the Syrian community for all the incredible work he's done, keeping everyone focused on the story. Hamza almost needs no introduction. We've just lived with you and your story for an hour and a half. You are a saint and an inspiration, and I'd like to have a long dinner with you, hearing your stories. Amazing. But I want to add one detail that was not in the film. In September 2016, while in Aleppo under siege, he started a petition on change.org calling for world leaders to prevent the impending disaster in Aleppo. It was published by newspapers around the world and garnered 750,000 signatures. And that was just before you were forced out of Aleppo to Turkey, where you worked for a while. But I believe you and Waad are now in London. Is that your home? Wonderful. And Edward Watts, who is the co-director with Waad, is an Emmy Award-winning, BAFTA-nominated filmmaker. He's directed over 20 narrative and documentary films around the world. His 2015 film, Escape from ISIS, exposed the brutal treatment of the estimated 4 million women living under the rule of the Islamic State. And just one other interesting fact, he and I made a film together in Guinea-Bissau for Channel 4. Totally unrelated. So anyway. Please, Charles, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Is this working? Everyone can hear me? Kate, thank you so much for the introduction. And Hamza, Ed, real pleasure to have you here as friends and as heroes. And the film, I think everyone would agree, is an extraordinarily powerful piece of theatre. And your bravery with Waad, who's also a good friend, and we're really sorry Waad wasn't able to make it. The New York airports weren't cooperating with us tonight, but it's really great to have you both here. And yeah, what a film! I have to say, as a father of a 2-year-old girl, it hits particularly hard. And it's the one thing that really struck me was, and I've seen lots of different, you will think, but that was what hit me the most, was that there is a war. We hear about the war all the time. We hear about the politics. But we don't often get that deep insight into what it's like just for normal human beings to live throughout that and the implications of living through that, what it means to stay in your city despite the risks and the costs. So really congratulations and well done on in case. So before we go into Syria in depth, I wanted to ask, I guess, first a question to Ed, which is just if you could tell the audience about, how this all came about. I know the story, but I'm sure everyone would benefit from hearing it. Obviously, Hamza and Waad got out of Aleppo with a huge volume of material. But if you could tell us about sort of how you managed to get so much material, compile it into 90 minutes, whether you decided to focus it specifically on summer and on the human angle, and how that whole process went about.
Yeah, I mean, it was not only the incredible bravery of the life that these guys lived, but to capture, as she did, she captured over 500 hours of material, filming like different bits every day. And I think you're right, we have never seen like the human face of war in this way because of Waad's incredible gift as a filmmaker. I think she's one of the most naturally gifted filmmakers, and also being a woman, looking at the conflict, dramatic or important part. But what you see in Waad's footage is just, she had an eye for just the detail and the broad spectrum of human life. And she managed to capture things that we're all aware of that exist in these like conflict zones, but have never seen before on film, like the beautiful things about human beings in these situations, the humor, the jokes that people tell. I only met her, she filmed everything, as I say. I only met her after the tragic events in the film were complete, and no one knew, really, apart from Hamza, knew what she'd been doing. Some of her material had been on the news, but really a tiny fraction of what you saw in the film. So she came to London to see her colleagues at Channel 4 News with these war-battered hard drives and just put them down on a table and said, "Look what I've got." And they were like, wow, what do we do with this? And they called me in because they knew that for years I'd been saying to them, we needed to make films about people like Waad and Hamza, and being met with the most savage government violence that I think we've seen since the Second World War. And I felt from minute one when that was starting out that we all of us had a stake in how that struggle and that conflict would work out. So we were lucky, I was fortunate with the honor of like opening up her life and their story. And I I don't want to go on too long, but just to say, from that first hour when she and I sat together and she just started showing me some of their stuff, I've been working as a documentary maker for 12 years. I knew that it was the most extraordinary archive of documentary footage that I think had ever existed. And it's a funny thing whenever you make a film, but from seeing Waad's footage and learning about their lives, it was like the other way around. It was like, this has to be this great. And if it isn't, then we've all like failed to do justice to their incredible lives, to her incredible ability and gifts as a filmmaker. And thankfully, hopefully, it is going around the world, it is connecting with audiences. And so, basically, the job is complete.
Right. Well, you did an amazing job, all of you. Hamza, I wanted to ask you a question about hospitals, specifically. Not in Syria at all, but specifically in Aleppo. Hospitals, the security of hospitals continues to be a significant issue. The UN has been debating this and discussing it for the last few months, specifically around allegations that the Russian government has been purposefully targeting hospitals. So that's to provide their coordinates to the United Nations, to avoid being targeted in Syrian and Russian airstrikes. And it just so happened that many of those hospitals who chose to share their coordinates ended up being hit in precision airstrikes. Almost entirely, I assume, by Russian jets. In fact, the New York Times just had a story a few weeks ago, which actually they had chosen to consciously, purposefully target deconflicted, using the UN terminology, hospitals. But I just wonder if you could give us a little bit more of an insight into whether or not that deconfliction mechanism was in place in Aleppo when you were there, what your opinion is on all of that.
So yeah, it's a not easy question.
Yeah, I know.
It's long. Basically, it's like just being a hospital manager has its challenges all over the world, like to obtain the human resources, getting the fund, the logistics, etc. While in like a conflict area itself, it will be a little bit difficult with the limited human resources and limited sources in general. Hospital, like everyone knows, it's a target, that the hospital is the main target of the Russian and the Syrian regime. And everyone knew that, like simply. I had patients that were refusing to be admitted at the hospital if their treatment was longer than 3 or 4 days. They would tell me, like, doctor, it's too dangerous. Just give us the IV drugs and we'll take it home. I will not stay here with you like for 5 days. It's too dangerous. When we moved the hospital to the other location, escaped. It's too dangerous for us to stay close to a hospital. So they just moved away when we started to like rebuild the new location. And just unfortunate, like the only reason why the Al-Quds hospital was the last hospital in Aleppo, because I refused to give the location to the UN, even though they asked for it several times. And even in the last few days of the siege, like I remember in the beginning of December 2016, like it was an amazing idea, literally, I'm speaking literally. The guy, I think he was Egyptian. I mean, like we had a great idea to save the hospital. That was like, tell me exactly. And he told me like we were talking with the Russian and they told us that they don't know where the hospital is and it might be mistakenly bombed. So we think you should give us the location, the coordinates of the hospital. And we were new here. And because like anyone who can like following whatever is going on, seeing the Russian has bombed 9 hospitals out of 10 in Aleppo, and now just asking me when we are completely trapped to share the location. And it was just, I asked him after that, if I shared the location and the hospital was bombed, would your statement be clearly that the Russian has targeted the hospital? Because till the moment, all the UN agencies' statements is with passive voice, that the hospitals were bombed, children were killed, like, the aliens just targeting Syria. And it's very like, for the victims, it's very targeted the hospital. And while like the UN agencies kept saying that it's in passive voice. And I asked him, would your statement be clearly that the Russian has targeted the hospital? And he said, literally said, like, don't push too hard, we can't do this. It's just some political issues, we're not going to say that. So I told him, like, if I give you the location now, and the hospital was targeted after 2 days, you won't even state that the Russian has targeted. And he said, no. So I told him, I'm sorry, we're not going.
Well, straight from the horse's mouth, so I hope everyone took that in. Another question, Hamza, as an extension of that. I mean, I think it's quite clear from your voice and from many Syrians who have survived similar stories that there's a real sense and a deserved sense that the international community has failed them. Yeah. The world right now, and I hear it working on Syria every day, it's someone else's problem. I know you don't believe that to be true. I certainly don't, and I know Ed doesn't. But explain why that's not true.
So, after seeing the film, when I have a small idea why it's not true. Basically, it's just now we're talking about 6 million refugees all around the strikes again on Aleppo, for example, doesn't mean that Aleppo now is safe and we can all go back to Aleppo, because basically the government, Syrian regime, will not shell themselves. So if they're controlling now Syria, that doesn't mean that the war is over and everything is fine, because everything started because they were controlling Syria. And this is like that we were in, and like went to Turkey and to the UK and realized first thing that we're not the center of attention for all the world. And because we believe that everyone knew what was going on in Syria. I thought like all the American citizens knew exactly what was going on. Like the British, they knew what was going on, and how come like nobody done anything. But when I went out, I realized like, no, only like went by all the propaganda from the Russian and the Syrian regime, or the small bit that they see on the news about the ISIS, the extremists, etc. So I'll understand that they will think it's over because ISIS is over. But our problem wasn't ISIS. It was one of our problems, of course. But when it started at 2011, our problem was because of the dictatorship, of al-Assad dictatorship, which is still president runners. That I think the Washington Post did some survey with 9 candidates about like, are you willing to regain your relationship with the regime? And 3 of them said like, yes, it's not our problem. So it's just like those government people or those like president runners know exactly what was going on. That I can't understand how can they be easy just to get their relation. Past few months, since last April, the situation is worse and worse than ever because it's less attention for the news. Since last April, more than 50 hospitals were targeted in Idlib. More than 800 children were killed. In the past 3 days, 2 hospitals were targeted. One of them was maternity. They don't treat, even if they want to treat fighters, they don't know how to do it. So it just being like the systemic of the attacks against the hospital, against the civilian resilience, against the schools. It's now become more and more and more. Now you have countries safe. No more body bombs is being dropped. Just please go back to your country. And this is what we hope this film can show, that the war is not over. First of all, it's not a war, it's a revolution. And it will not be over until justice is happen, until Assad is down, and until like accountability take place.
Well, I think, our failure to do anything about what happened here, despite saying never again, whenever these atrocities happen, was based perhaps on the desire not to make a mess of things, as we did in Iraq or in Libya, but also I think a fundamental misreading of the situation, which is very relevant being in this town. I think people don't necessarily it's like the same people who are bombing Waad and Hamza are the people who the government who poison people in a quiet town in England, or who are attempting to corrupt your electoral system. And that's one of the points we're trying to make. Join the dots here, you know? This is what we're trying to get across. This is not like a couple of hospitals being hit. This is a direct policy of war. And that used to be a norm, you know? Like, if there are such things as rules of war, there was something believed to be semi-sacred about medical facilities. And that is now completely gone. It's now standard. Of course, you bomb the norms that have kept us all safe, that have governed the international system for so long, have been eroded and swept away because of Syria. And that makes all of us, you know, under threat. And I think that one of the big messages of the film, and what you see in the film, is how much humanity we share with people in Syria, how much our values are the film, you know, that we need to understand. We no longer live in a world where you can say, well, it's happening to those people 7,000 miles away, and we're over here and we're okay. So, you know, it's a shame, but so be it. We're now fundamentally linked and all in it together in this like struggle for the world, if that doesn't sound too dramatic.
No, I completely agree. As someone who half answered it, but it's a kind of an unfair question to ask, or it's a difficult one. But you know, we're 9 years on. What did we in the West get wrong? Like, what did we do wrong? Or as someone who's working in filmmaking with a relationship with the news media, you know, what have we all collectively missed here? That there was never a sense of urgency. At periods of time, there was significant concern. Nor missing here, or is this just a terrible reflection of humanity?
I mean, one of the things I think filmmakers and people like my colleagues and myself to an extent, you know, we failed in our storytelling. Basically, you know, we lapsed. We're like, for example, the propaganda immediately, like, oh, there are terrorists there, you know. They also use the way that our news reports are obsessed with objectivity. So we feel like we always have to say, oh, well, these guys are doing something and those guys are doing something. But as you've shown in your work repeatedly, you can't actually put them on a par when something like 96% of the civilian deaths in Syria are a result of the regime or the Russians, and 2% are saying, oh, well, you know, the regime have shelled this town, but the opposition fighters also executed 3 prisoners. And it was like presented, if you were just watching the news, you'd be like, oh God, they're all as bad as each other. And so I think there was a big failure of storytelling and a tendency to fall into, as I say, the terrorist thing. But I think the fundamental mistake is it's like one day people are going to people who are willing to use violence on this scale has endangered us all. It's emboldened them basically to start tearing our international system apart. And I think, you know, to an extent, we believe that, as I said sort of slightly, we could sit this out, you know. This red line, I think, is one of the greatest geopolitical mistakes that has ever been made. I remember being in a refugee camp in 2014, and this Syrian guy came up to me, and pardon my French, he went, hey, you're British? And I was like, yeah. He went, well, tell Ed Miliband to go fuck himself. And I was like, how do you know who Ed Miliband is? Most people in Britain don't know who Ed Miliband is. Right. But they knew because he'd voted, showed the world that ultimately we wanted to stay safe more than we were willing to like actually put steel behind our values and stand up and fight for what we believe in. And I think so much of our problems now stem from that.
Right. Watch all the West media talking about what's going on in Syria since the beginning, 2011, 2012. It was all about revolution. It was all about like falling against the dictatorship, etc. And then 2013, the narrative all has changed to become about ISIS, jihadists, etc. And it's still reported about in 2011 and 2012. There are hundreds of thousands of protesters. I'll be afraid if all of them became terrorists. Mm-hmm. So like they are still there and they are still in the struggle. Another thing that when I was in Aleppo and ISIS was there, etc. And then like there was a video from ISIS beheading someone. Even we were targeted now, the world will show no interest in that for the next week. Everyone will be talking about that video, or the media news, or the reporters. And that happened a lot. Like during the siege on Aleppo, or during the massive attacks of the regime on Aleppo, there'll be something like talking about Aleppo that time, then they will all be shifted to talk about this and forgetting about what's going on for the next week or 10 days when the regime and the Russian have done their job.
Right.
Can I just add one thing as well? Like one thing which I'd love, as a call to action to all of you guys in this room, like I think there's an amazing piece of analysis and investigation to be done into the relationship between the regime and ISIS, you know? And because like a lot of the attacks that were perpetrated on American soldiers while they were in Iraq, I remember there was an interview with an FSA fighter telling this story about how they were attacking a government area and ISIS came behind them and started attacking their rear. And so many of these guys' stories, like a lot of the circumstantial evidence about the way in which they cooperate.
There's so many reports and studies about that, because most of the jihadist leaders, even from like anyone who's following Syria, you know, like Ahrar al-Sham or Jabhat Nusra or even ISIS, the big leaders, most of them were in the regime presence in 2011, and they were all released in the mid of 2012 by the regime. And just at least the regime know that if you release a jihadist to an ungovernment controlled area where weapons everywhere, like of course they will not sit at home. And just like every Syrian knows about this, and there are a lot of reports by Western, but it's still all ignored by a lot of people and a lot of governments.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I've done a lot of research on it myself. There are nearly a dozen civil cases in the US of families suing the Syrian regime for complicity or negligence in ISIS and going back to the Iraq war times, al-Qaeda in Iraq. For all too many people, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. How can you possibly imagine a government cooperating with something like ISIS? But I have a whole chapter of it in my book. It's all documented. It's evidence. It's not a theory.
It's not only that. Like now, I remember and it's on YouTube. Like anyone can find it. He said like if the Americans or the Western country tried to interfere in Syria, we will let a lot of suiciders just go and explode themselves in their cities. We will attack them there. And it's all there in the news.
Right. The Grand Mufti, Hassan.
Hassan.
Yeah, right. I could carry on this conversation forever. I have a million of other questions, but I do want to shoot it out to the audience. So in the interest of time, we'll take three.
The massacre that was shown in the documentary, was all of that known through other news media contemporaneously, or was there a surprise that when all these bodies were fished out coming?
You're talking about the river bodies specifically.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Let's go, gentleman at the back. And then any women?
Lot. And you talk a lot about their role. What about trying to reach out to some of the Russian people, like maybe translating the movie or putting in Russian subtitles? Because, I mean, the Russian government's terrible, but the people, a lot of them would be moved by this. Mm-hmm. And it could help create at least some opposition.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
So
and then
I
we'll
hope
take
you do
this woman here, just in the middle. Right here. Sorry.
First, thank you so much for everything. So I'm a security student here at Georgetown, and I think when this kind of like power politics all the time, and it can be totally frustrating when you're trying to like bring up this like human security side of it. And I think filmmaking is an like incredible tool to actually push that. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you really like push it and like get the international community to lens?
It's a tough question. Right, so you've got three. I'll leave it up to you to
go on, I'm happy.
split them up.
So the first one, lots of people knew about that specific River Bodies massacre. It was widely publicised. I think one of the issues that in general about why people didn't necessarily engage with these stories a lot is because there was an almost semi-colonial attitude in the part of certain news organisations that if they didn't have their person there, which was impossible in a lot of parts of Syria, they relied on people like, "What shows this?" And all the time it was undercutting the veracity of that reporting, which personally, I was outraged by, because there's no way a citizen journalist could fake the bombing of a civilian area, for example. And I think that was one of the things that kind of, again, softened and muddied and confusion and denying everything, denying it to such an extent that, people began to question the veracity even of events as significant as that particular massacre.
Other questions about the Russian and the film?
I would love to send Ed to a screening there.
That's his best plan.
Just tweet about it. Ed is staying at that hotel. You can find him in Russia.
Coordinates.
Exactly, I'll share
Yeah,
the
right.
coordinates.
Yeah, he keeps trying to buy me a ticket. He's like, when do you want to go, my friend? Please.
So I think we'll, like, to be frank, the first showing there, etc. But also because like, as a person who lived there, I felt like everyone knew about it, etc. But then, like, several discussions and studies, etc., I've read that not all the Russians are supporting their government, or particularly knew what was going on. They were all driven by the propaganda that they were fighting terrorism on behalf of the whole world, etc. So I think that
About the things that are being done, you know better than us, and that is why we're so keen to connect with them and find the right safe space. Because I think one of the literal concerns is that if they got their hands on the film, like the government literally had it, they'd mash it up and twist it and do all sorts. They've done that to a BBC report from a few years back, which showed like the incendiary bombing of a school, you know, and like children with skin hanging off being brought into a hospital, and yet they've still mashed that up and attempted to deny the truth of that. So we want to do it. We completely agree with your point of view. It's just trying.
And human security. That's a tough question.
yeah,
That's a big one.
you go for it.
You start. You need to stand up and say to your teachers, no, like you're parroting old theories that don't hold up anymore. And all you got to do is point them to the world. It's out of date, 1945, you know? And this is like, you are the people who can lead them. You can teach them and help them understand, I would say, like what's going on in the world. I'm going to steal one of Hamza's lines for once. He always says, you know, we've lost faith as a team in governments, you know, in the ability of governments, but we got so much faith in people. And that's what this film is about. And that's what we need now. Like all of us, in all of our countries, like there's so much trouble. The world is on fire, you know, whether it's in Hong Kong or like Haiti or Chile or mushroom.
Agree. Another clap.
And DC.
So I know we're really tight on time, but I really want to give 3 more questions. If a quick rapid fire go. So we'll take Mohammed, and one here, and one over at the end. And I'm sure there'll be time for others to.
Thank you
ask
very much,
questions after.
Hamza, Ed, and Waad. Just spoke yesterday. It was in media. He said he resigned not to shake hands with Assad, although he shook hands with Assad tons of times physically.
Exactly, so many pictures.
Exactly, yeah. And he stayed there for 4.5 years, almost 5 years. So whenever UN official retires, they remember they resigned protesting something. You were evacuated the people, but he was facilitating a forced displacement of population, really, which the CUI called out and called a war crime. How did people react to Stefan de Mistura in Aleppo? How he was portrayed between the people, other than he's the one who's failing to protect people or to do his job?
Okay.
Really far.
Thank you. Just want to say thank you for the film. It's really powerful, and thank you for being here tonight. I hope the film makes a difference. It really deserves to.
Good question. And then find a question over here on the end at the front.
Thank you. First of all, it was a privilege to watch this movie. I want to ask a question about your wife. Why did she ever beginning to film, and what force sustained her to continue filming and documenting? And was she ever felt threatened by anyone, any of the militias? Did she ever get into trouble by any forces in Syria?
Very funny for me to see Muhammad Abdullah here because in the beginning of the revolution, 2011, I was just waiting to see him on Al Jazeera or something, smashing the floor with the regime people, and then go and demonstrate. So it's just
small world.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't know that you're too young and tall.
So tall.
Exactly. So basically, regarding the displacement out of Aleppo, and no one from the UN was there. So it was only the Syrian Arab Red Crescent which their رئيس فخري.
President.
رئيس فخري شو بالإنجليزي؟ الرئيس الفخري.
Honorary
President is Bashar al-Assad. They were the one that facilitating the displacement, and we were told that the UN was there, but their cars were under the ground, and everyone in Aleppo was looking to the Ministora as he was affiliated by the regime, was doing nothing, and it was just a waste of time and resources on something that will never work. And we really felt that everything he has done or stated was misleaded or aim to mislead the community. One of them, like that last statement that he resigned because he didn't want to shake the hand of the regime. And immediately you can see it like on all the Twitter and everything. It was just for the UN history. The Sama, she's now 4 years old, and Taima, should always mention her after the film. She's 2.5 years old. They're doing well. Best sisters, going out to the nursery, start to get this weird British accent.
Being demonstrated here.
Exactly.
We feel like we're kind of stable, we're in this city. We'll stay there at least for the 5 years, which we get the residency for, and then we'll figure it out.
Tell the story about the trailer. The trailer, Sama
watched the trailer like a week ago, 4 or 5 days ago, and like it was the first time that she watched the trailer completely, and she was just dealing with it like, oh, he's massive, that happened, and she was like, did like this, and she was like, Mommy, where is Sama? What happened to Sama? You're like, come on, you're fine.
You're here.
You're here. Nothing happened. And then she started to say, it's snow. And then, it does snow. And the last question about Waad. Waad, she studied marketing. She always wanted to become a journalist. She wanted to study journalism. But it was so difficult in Syria because you don't have this objective journalism. You'll be just a tool with the regime to write whatever they want to do. And that's why she had this debate with her parents what to study, etc. She decided to do marketing, which to document with a secret camera, with a pen or a button camera. She started to do it. And then she got her first camera, which she was also filming. She get hole in her bags and just put the camera in and try to film what's going on. And then when she moved to east part of Aleppo, she started to film on a regular basis. She's very stubborn that she was filming everything. She never stopped. She was so... But she kept filming everything. She always felt that something might happen and it need to be documented. There are few times when she lost hope because she was filming a lot, showing everything what's going on, but nobody was reacting, nobody was doing anything. But at least she got the feeling that at least it's saving our story. One day we'll have bothered by there are east part of Aleppo particularly is a conservative Muslim part of Aleppo, so having I think not only in Aleppo. After going out, I thought we're just that something about the Middle East, but I think everywhere having women filming in war zones is not just something common. So she was asked several times about her ID, what she's going on, home, where she came from, where her parents, what religion she is, has she other nationality. Well, even if I wasn't there, we'll stand for her. No, she's our neighbor. Don't talk to her. And we got her. It also helped that we were at the hospital, and also after we got married, that it's not good. It's not a little bit rude to say it, but she's the wife of the doctor who's running the hospital. So we're known in the community as those couple who's living there, etc.
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, although I think we could all listen to this for much longer. Yeah, on behalf of the Middle East Institute, thank you so much, Hamza, Ed,
Thanks.
and please pass my best to.
Thank you.